Good evening, everyone. It, my name is Naren. This is Naren's Life with MS, and it is the second episode of Treatment Tuesday. And, considering that last week I pretty much discussed everything that happened with Copaxone, I want to go on to my second treatment that happened after Copaxone. And Copaxone stayed with me pretty much all throughout college, and then once I graduated and pretty much moved out here back home to India, I realized that Copaxone would be much more difficult to get, and unfortunately, due to there not being a generic version of Copaxone available, it was going to be much more expensive to procure in India. So as a result, my doctor back then, he was a neurologist. I don't think he was an MS specialist per se. Decided to go I want to say he just decided to choose an alternative to Copaxone, which was Avonex. Now, the funny part about Copaxone and Avonex, they were part of what was back then called the ABC. I think they might still call it the ABC of MS medication, which were slightly lower efficacy drugs that were designed for people who didn't show as many symptoms. So A stood for Avonex, B stood for beta-seron, and C stood for Copaxone. Now, Copaxone in comparison to Avonex was a lot easier because there weren't any actual side effects apart from the injection site bruises or just a little bit of supposed like subcutaneous fat loss as a result of you having to do these subcutaneous injections. But Avonex was a completely different story, and if I compare all three of my treatments, I'd say Avonex definitely was takes the short end of the stick there, because it now that I think about it, it was pretty painful. Right now, let's go over the pros of Avonex in comparison to Copaxone. First of all, Avonex was a once a week injection as opposed to the daily injections that I was pretty much dealing with Copaxone. But on the downside, considering it was an interferon and it worked like an interferon, I pretty much would lose a full day in my week just recovering from taking that medication. Now, one thing that's pretty interesting is that Avonex is an intramuscular medication as opposed to Copaxone, which is just in the subcutaneous layer. So Copaxone would go right into the skin, while Avonex had a slightly longer needle, and you had to kind of jam it in the side of your thigh. And I'd say it wasn't painful as such, right? I'd gotten used to taking close to almost 1400 shots by myself. So by then I was just all ready to just go, okay, fine, click, and it's done. And the funny part was Avonex, each Avonex pen was its own thing. So once you used up one pen, it was ready for ready for the trash can. So that is one thing that I didn't like as much, because I was just thinking about how much how much more waste would be generated as a result. The thing with Copaxone was, you got a pen, you could load the syringe into the pen, and the syringe had a lot of parts which could have been pretty much reused, right? I mean, I actually had a little contraption that would clip the needle off once I was, done with injecting. And then, majority of the syringe was actually glass, which, hopefully could be reused, recycled. But um, knowing knowing that I studied waste management in the United States, um, that didn't happen a lot. So, and considering this was also medical waste, it would go straight to the incinerator. But even then, it was, that was also a little iffy over there. um, but with that being said, a lot of with Avonex, the easy part I think just stopped at the, I just had to take an injection once a week, right? There was no other benefit, right? If I go to the downsides, I mean, with taking interferons, the first thing is the next day becomes, I want to say, just, the worst part, like the trough of when you actually get sick. So it is when you get the fever, you have the chills, um, you're sweating and cold at the same time, but then you're shivering and hot at the same time. A very bad headache, which somehow no amount of paracetamol could take away. And because your body feels heavy right after taking the injection, or not right after but the day after, you're pretty much out for the count, so you effectively lose one day of the week, right? So I used to live on a 6-day schedule, and out of the 6 days, 5 days I was working. So you know um, not the best weekends, not the best weekend plans either. And and I think the reason I was offered Avonex over anything else was just because I was still relatively active at that point in time. I think my I hadn't gotten to the point where I was falling all over the place, or I didn't have that many issues with walking a decent amount, or even running a decent amount. I would, at that point in time, I remember I used to between 2011 when I was in college and about 2016, every year I would actually go on a service trip, doing community service in some remote location in a separate country, and I would travel alone, um, majority of the time, or at least with a group of volunteers, and then we would volunteer pretty much the 7 to 10 day trip that it was, and then after all of that, pretty much back home and come back, right? A lot of it did involve hiking, it did involve camping, which back then I realized that I was really into. So honestly, I think at least back then, MS didn't feel like it was the biggest thing, but honestly now, looking at my health, I think it's definitely a wrench that has been thrown in there. But with that being said, I even remember taking Avonex pens to Nepal. I was going to Nepal while I was on Avonex, and having to inject myself, and then just having to pretty much laugh off that one day that I would face flu-like symptoms, have a terrible fever, a lot of body ache, um, and of course the inability to really move around, right? And the thing with when you're camping is you can really only sit in your tent when it's dark outside. And so the rest of the day I'd have to somehow stumble my way across and just try to find a way to keep myself cool but wrapped up at the same time. um, Try half-heartedly to hope that the medication, any medication for a headache would work, um, or even a fever for that matter. So it was, quite a few things rolled into one. And I would say, despite all of those things, and they all kind of sound very annoying, right? Back then, I mean, they were annoying back then. They sound annoying when I think about it now. But I'd say probably the worst experience of having Avonex was there was just a certain smell that would, happen when I would inject myself. And it kind of was a little bit of, me using the rubbing alcohol to just make sure that part of the injection site was clean. But I think there was a little bit of odor in the medication as well, and it would just make me feel so sick. I would be almost ready to vomit right after taking the Avonex. And of course, the smell would pretty much dissipate once the injection was complete. And so that's why I always thought that it was maybe the smell of, the medication that was kind of coming out. And it would just, honestly, it was such a nauseating smell that I felt, like, I was ready to just give up my lunch or dinner or whatever it was at that point in time. So I'd say that was probably the worst experience of Avonex. But I'd say Avonex overall, comparing the three treatments I've been on, I'd say Avonex probably is dead last. And funnily enough, Avonex, a couple of people that I've talked to who have used Avonex also, have similar experiences that, it wasn't, their cup of tea. It wasn't definitely something that helped them. And I want to say that while I was on Avonex, I definitely had one known relapse and one relapse, which at that time my doctor did mention that could have been, a silent relapse, so that my body did relapse. And um, I didn't realize it because maybe I wasn't sick at that point in time. And so I'll just tell you the dates. The relapse that definitely did happen, and I do remember because I collapsed in front of my office. I had trouble walking. I couldn't, my vision became hazy. I could not, I wasn't able to even walk 2 steps without holding on to something. And at that point where I was relatively independent, it felt pretty bad. And this was in, I would say, October. No, not October. I would say August 12th, 2018 was the day where I collapsed in front of my office and just suddenly felt that entire weight of that relapse. So I'd say that was the day that it kind of, happened. And, it was a known relapse. But the hidden relapse probably happened somewhere around April 2016. And the reason I say April 2016 is I remember a few months after that, around September, I actually traveled to Nepal again for my second and last time. And I remember it was so much more difficult to traverse the same place I had been the year before. So that is, just a quick um, lowdown. And I know that I'm saying quick when I've definitely talked for quite a while. But that's just a quick summary of my experience with Avonex. I was on Avonex for, I want to say, 4 years, few months, from I think June of 2014 to August of July or August of 2018. And I'd say the relapse that I experienced in 2018 was pretty much the end of me using Avonex, and I pretty much got an actual MS specialist that I still use to this day, and uh, changed my medication, which honestly came more as a relief because um, I realized that Avonex probably wasn't my cup of tea. Now, of course, this is my own personal experience with Avonex. There definitely are people who have not had as bad of an experience, or definitely had Avonex help them, right? In terms of efficacy, I mean, all drugs that are aimed at multiple sclerosis do have a certain level of efficacy, which means it does help a group of individuals, reduce the number of times they have relapses. It reduces the the extent of the relapses, however bad it can be. But I definitely know that, just like Copaxone, where I had at least one relapse, which was known just after I started the medication. With this one, there were two relapses. One that was definitely a silent one that I didn't really know until I was actually in the field. I was actually facing the fire, and the second one being 2018, which definitely was, you know, a bit of a game changer. I mean, it changed a lot of things for me. So that pretty much covers my time with Avonex. And of course, after this, I will get on next week. You will get to hear about my current treatment, right? There are certain ups, certain downs, uh, and definitely a few stories that are a little, you know, funny to think about. I don't know if you'll find them funny upon hearing them. But with that being said, I hope you're having a great Tuesday. I hope your week started off well. And with that said, thank you so much for listening in. Please provide any, any of your feedback. I mean, if you did take Avonex, right, what were some of the side effects that you experienced? What were some of the downsides you saw, or some of the upsides, if you actually saw more upsides on upon taking Avonex? And if you did take Avonex, I mean, are you still on it, or did you only have it for a certain amount of time? I mean, that would definitely help in getting us started on the conversation about how good or how effective Avonex was as a MS treatment. And with that being said, I do want to say good night to everyone, and I hope you do provide your comments, and let's get the conversation started. Thank you. Good night.